Washing session. Track one is over in the room we've been in all morning. And we have folks joining us on Zoom and our recording session, so please do make sure your ringers are off. And if you need to have a conversation, you can step right outside. Please start the recording. All right, Sarah, Armbruster. Either way, great. Is the coordinator for the Washington Gleaning Network at Harvest Against Hunger in Seattle, Washington. She manages day-to-day operations, research, and planning to maintain a structure that supports and grows gleaning organizations throughout Washington state. Her background is in strategy and food systems, and she's passionate about creating systems of food that truly serve the needs of those it was built to serve, and ensuring that quality, healthy food is accessible to everyone. Jennifer Roberts is a Harvest Vista member with the Washington Gleaning Network. A recent graduate from the University of Washington, she learned about the environmental and social impact that food waste and food security has on communities across the country. Prior to serving as an AmeriCorps Vista member, Jenna worked as a congressional intern in Washington's 1st District and as a refugee resettlement intern in the Western Washington area. She's excited to continue to serve the Washington community as a Harvest Vista member with the Washington Gleaning Network. In this session, Sarah and Jen will dive into what the Washington Gleaning Network has accomplished over the past few years, unveil their new toolkit that breaks down how they built Washington's statewide gleaning network, and hear directly from panelists across the local gleaning community about their program successes, challenges, and how network support makes a real difference in their work. The gleaning program is a boots on the ground, but a gleaning network is the connective tissue that strengthens individual programs in their own communities while amplifying their collective impact far beyond what any single organization could achieve alone. Over to y'all.
Sarah, I am the coordinator of the Washington Gleaning Network at Harvest Against Hunger in Seattle. And this is Jen. She's going to be talking here too. She has some really great resources to share. She's been really supporting awesome work that we are doing with the Washington Gleaning Network. So I don't know if it's too bright. Can you guys see okay? This is the Washington Gleaning Network, the mission that we are working to support and to grow and support the gleaning movement in Washington state. And I want to give you an overview today of what we do and why. So let's go ahead. Next slide. So this is Washington State. For anyone who isn't familiar, it's got a big mountain running right down the middle. Just kind of an east side, west side vibe going on with that. The mountains are really genuinely difficult to cross in winter. That means there's two very different landscapes, two very different growing seasons, two very different, like cultures as well sometimes. And it's really, again, genuinely difficult to cross in winter. And it's a really big state, and there's a lot of leaders here. And it turns out, according to the National Gleaning Project, next slide, please. Oh, this is not good. Well, imagine that's the US. So, there. According to the National Gleaning Project, most states have somewhere between 1 and 10 gleaning organizations. Washington State has more than 40 that we know of, and you all in California are winning with more than 50, so we know exactly what we're talking about when we say they say lots of gleaners. So here's what that kind of looks like. So this is my editor view of our membership map. It didn't show up. Okay, we can imagine. It's like a lot of numbers here. And that was the point I wanted to show you. But most of the numbers are like the first 3-4 of these points here. The rest of them are really small numbers, so like 1s and 2s. And to illustrate that, this is the map of all the organizations involved with Washington Gleaning Network in Washington State. And you can really notice where the numbers kind of clump together, like where there's a lot of so big clumps right there. Especially the Puget Sound area, the Seattle, like the Puget Sound corridor, and it's a really interesting thing to consider because it tells you something. If you look at where all the clumps are, they're coordinated right where the big resources are. And all of those ones and twos that exist elsewhere really kind of showed you that there's a lot of rural valleys and isolated cities, a lot of gleaning happening, and there's a lot of distance between it. You'll also notice that every point on this map, if you can see it, is marked with a star. I put those there, so we'll love them for a minute. First, I would love if you would take a moment and kind of imagine to yourself. Imagine that you are the only gleaner in your county, right? You are the one person doing this work for a while. You maybe have never met someone from another gleaning program. And you're making decisions about liability, about volunteer management, about farmer and community relationships, mostly on your own, kind of figuring it out as you go. And you may not always know if what you're doing is working. You may not have someone to call when the harvest comes in faster than it's expected to, and you need 6 more volunteers by Saturday morning. You're out there, you're stuck, you're shining all on your own. Next slide, please. But here's the thing about stars. Stars exist within systems larger than themselves, right? Science. And when someone looks up and traces the lines between them, a constellation emerges. Something becomes visible that was not visible before. So let's apply that logic to gleaning programs. When you imagine you were a rural gleaning program, you're a star shining out there, whether anyone sees it or not. When you reach out to other gleaners, a whole system of connections emerges that never existed before. The relationships between gleaning programs start to matter almost as much as what each program does individually, right? A gleaning program in Spokane can learn from one in Bellingham. They both grow. A gleaning program in Okanagan, oh, they're not in the room. Hey, there you go. A gleaning program in Okanagan is creating a map that others should follow. And with connections, we really become more than the sum of our hearts. And let's take that logic and zoom in just a little bit more at the level where a gleaning program exists within its own community. The same is true. The relationships between a gleaning program and the people around it matter almost as much as the harvest itself. The volunteer who shows up every Saturday. The farmer who saves you a row of apples. The food bank coordinator that knows every single one of its partners. The community becomes more than the sum of its harvest. And at each level, we can say the pattern is kind of the same. It's community, it's relationships, connections. And what we've learned doing this work over the last few years, and maybe it's kind of a radical idea, next slide, please, is that community is not just a nice byproduct of gleaning. It is a goal. And I want us to sit with that for a second, because I think it runs a little counter to how a lot of us think and talk about this work. When we talk about our work, we're used to leading with numbers, right? We're used to leading with pounds gleaned, with meals provided, volunteer hours logged, and those numbers do matter. But here's what we've also noticed, is that the most sustainable gleaning programs, the ones that sustain over time, are not always the most efficient ones, but they are the most connected ones. They have volunteers who show up season after season because they feel like they are making a difference and they belong, they're making a difference in their community. We have farmers who open their fields because they trust fast feed. They have partners who put the phone on that first grading because the relationship is real. And it's not a byproduct of doing work. It's what makes doing the work possible. Next slide. So I want to tell you, I want to tell you about our CO. It's a relatively new program run by the Okanagan Community Action Council on the north part of central Washington, one of those counties with the one on the map. It's a very rural area. It's also geographically, I think, the biggest county in Washington State. And this little like this is Okanagan. It's massive. One gleaning program. And it really, sorry, I lost my place in my notes. So one of the great things about harvesting hope that I've noticed is that a Gleaning program existed years ago, but it's often the story in our line of work. The person running it left and the program dissolved. And now, a few years later, it's come back with something stronger than it ever really was before. And what's really beautiful about that is that the program didn't start with a grant. It didn't start with a strategic plan or a staff position. It started with a connection and a conversation made with someone in the community who recognized a need and decided to do something about it. Volunteers showed up first, then a coordinator was hired, then the grants followed, but that institutional infrastructure kind of came after the relationships from that before. And this sequence really matters because it illustrates how firmly they are rooted in their community. What they built wasn't just a restart. Their Gleaning program grew back as something bigger and stronger than it was before. So, and you can correct me if I'm not like getting all the information here, but Harvesting Hope is now a Gleaning program, a community garden incubator, and also a grow a road program. Woven together, community centric, way more than some of its parts. And they built that. We didn't create that, and we don't take credit for it. We were there as part of the conversation to learn alongside them. And what we learned was something we could not have learned any other way. That when a program is built on community, on relationships, it has roots. It can survive and grow because it lives in more than one place, and more than one person, and more than one organization. So let's open up the other way.
The other way? One more back.
Oh wait, go with me. Nope, yep, you're right. Wow. Yeah. Okay, so let's into what the Walker Gleaning Network does. So every Gleaning program is a star, and it's connected by constellations. Then you could say that our work is to tend the space where the constellations form, right? And we're not the constellations. And here's the distinction that matters a lot to us. A lot of network organizations might look up at the sky and say, so you 3 stars, you're now a constellation, and this is your name, and this is what we're going to do, and this is how you're going to do it. But that's not what we do. We look up at the sky and we say, how do you mention? You know, how do you know there's someone over the other side of the mountain that's doing something really similar to what you're doing? And the difference there is where the agency lies. In the first example, it lies with the network. In the second example, it lives within the communities. And this matters because this approach helps lead to sustainability, the ability to sustain over time. And never sustained by one entity can disappear when that entity disappears. But if it lives within the hearts of each community, it's that keeps growing. Okay, so I think nodding heads and I see. You can already see the constellations beginning to form. And that knowledge is half the battle. In the way that growing and gathering food takes work, tending the space where the constellations form also takes work. It takes the slow, patient work of building relationships one at a time. And for us, every activity we do is in service of actively creating the conditions for that connection. So take the census, and we switched to terrible, but that one is we did last year. Every year we put one out across the state. On the surface, it's a data collection tool, but what it's also doing is making the network visible to itself. So when they're in Yakima, can see that there's someone who's similar work 2 counties over, and that's the first step towards a new connection. Our annual conference is the same logic. Getting people in the same room once a year isn't just about sharing information, though that happens too. It's also about the conversation that starts over lunch when you realize that the person sitting right next to you has solved a problem you could step on for months. And we have no control over these moments, but we can look at video. And we have meetings every other month on Zoom to keep the thread alive between the physical gatherings. Those consistency really matters, you know, in relationships. And those are a space to learn from each other, to share what's working, to ask questions, to start to surface problems before they become crises. And the group These are also the last three images here at the bottom are also kind of almost like a literal version of this. We come together, leaders from all over the state, from all over the region, to do it together. And we all are putting people on the same field at the same time. We'll volunteer for one program, might be a work trip for another program. Something clicks, ideas travel faster. And here's the thing. Even if we know all of this, we're still learning what it means. We are growing alongside the leaders that we are supporting. So I have a little bit of a sneak peek for you guys. I think you guys are some of the first people in the process. Before I wrap up, and I'll stop for a few minutes of Q&A before handing it over to you, Jen. But next slide, please. We won't have the findings on this until June. But this year, spring, we have partnered with the University of Washington on a capstone project. So they have a food systems nutrition and health program at the University of Washington. And two teams of students are spending the term trying to understand that reciprocity between the Okanagan community and the program itself out in Okanagan. It's kind of a case study on each side, from the community side and from the program side, and then kind of coming back to our synthesis to put it all together. And we'll be sharing everything we learned from that. And just like kind of the data sets that Sean was just talking about, we learned so much from these things that we didn't even realize was a thing when we set out. We were like, okay, we can solve this. But then we're like, oh, here's why that. You know, this is it. So it's just like a wonderful opportunity to begin that conversation and begin to essentially map. And I don't like to use the word model because I feel like model is rigid. It's telling people what to do and how to do it, which we can't do. Like, we can't just step into that community and say, oh, we know what you guys should do. But we can say, here's what they do over here. And here's resources that we can help offer. Whatever barrier you have, whether it's maybe we need more bins that all stick together. And that's the barrier that's keeping you from leaving somewhere. And keeping you from, you know, the waste system, everything else that we do. Maybe it's just bins. And if that's the case, we can figure out a way to make this work. So coming together and having our shared understanding of what our barriers are and what our strengths are, and we can share those together. I mean, that's why we're out here. I feel like I didn't even know that this whole conference would really almost like about saying the same thing over and over. We need to connect and it's important. But I feel like this is where we all are, and I feel like you all are completely agreeing on that. But anyways, thank you so much for listening to me. Thanks, bye. And there's Shameless plug. There's a newsletter. You're welcome to sign up for it. And kind of get it. Goes out about every month, and it's just what we're up to. What it is we have 19 people and so on. So welcome to that. And I can set a 5-minute timer and open it up for a few questions if you guys have them before I turn it over. So and hi everyone. Yeah, questions or comments?
This is amazing. I ran the Gleaning network for 4 years, and I was involved in sort of like helping these organizations that were existing food systems with students and conceptualize cleaning. But it sounds like you already had like a network of cleaners, informal, or you had a large number of cleaners and decided to form a network after it. So I think
yeah, I mean, if I'm getting your question right, it's like how do we start this and where did all the numbers and stuff come from?
sort of the difference between like connecting an existing network that just needs to be formalized versus like using a network, using the network model to actually help replicate leading programs. And in particular, like in Baja Peninsula, where I live, one of the only cleaning organization, and how might we use models of like this become to replicate the importance of community building cleaning initiatives.
So that goes that. So that is actually something that Jim's going to start to show us here in a few minutes. So what Jim has done is build a toolkit for how we go about network. And one of the things that we find so valuable with our network is being able to share how we done to everyone else. Because that's the thing, like the concepts and ideas feel like they're just impacts, but then you're like, but how do we actually do that? Like what are the steps? Do we need minutes for those steps? Like we never think about those things, we talk your concepts and just sharing those how-tos is a massive part of what we're doing. So more on that. And if you do have questions again on that, I'm here all day. And always happy to answer questions, hop on a chat with somebody, shoot me an email, whatever. There is I don't have the opinion on the tricks that I can do. I have the QR codes and stuff. Yes.
I'm curious to know a little bit structurally, you as the coordinator of the network, what does that mean? And what does participatory leadership or other type, like what do other types of leadership within the network look like?
Excellent. We're still figuring that out. So I was hired as premier for Vista. I was doing a few years ago. And that was in collaboration with AEO and a Seattle-based organization called Arts Against Hunger. And I was hired to help them go from concepts to how to actually do this. And my work currently is I was hired by Student Hunger right after my distance service to help to do the Washington Gleaning network. So in the process, we're figuring out what that structure is. And it's a huge learning experience. Do you have actually can you repeat the questions fast? Oh my gosh. Sorry, thank you for reminding. Yeah, and the question was what kind of is your formal structure and what does that look like? Being that I'm the coordinator of the program, yeah, and so basically, we're still kind of figuring that out. And I think that we can all kind of, I feel like we can all kind of visualize and see the information of this and where it can go. But how do you actually get there? What are the actual steps? And that is something we are all learning together.
I was just curious, and it's going to be opinion based. Just understanding like what kind of drew that culture in Washington State to Glean. Like what has like instilled this practice in that region? Just to understand like how we can replicate or what parts of like what's happening up there can be replicated in other regions.
So the question was, how do we sort of replicate the fact that Washington State has over 40 leading organizations involved in state? How do we replicate that in different places? And I think I cannot speak for everybody. In my opinion, I would say there's definitely a cultural thing. There's also a lot of support systems in our state, in our region, in our cities that help support this kind of work. There's a lot of strong lean towards like political lean towards waste reduction and all of these things that we all stand for and values. But that would be a really interesting thing to sort of like what are the things? Kind of like the map we're doing in Okanagan, like what are the moving parts? Who's doing the work? How is it funded? Like who's what are the community ties that keep it together? Sometimes it's about being in the right room with the right person at the right time. What does that look like? What does that mean? That is something that I think kind of figuring out. And I would love to, great question to ask a lot of people who feel in probably have some answers to some interesting insights. Really helpful.
And I even heard there's a name. There's definitely like there's been the sense of independence, like do it yourself culture, a large amount of small farms that are more willing to let people onto their farms. And just sort of like a culture of like you can do it, you can do it, maybe you can do it anywhere. And I don't know if that's similar in Washington.
Totally is. Yeah, I think so. I think there are a lot of independent and strong people in Washington. And speaking very good. We have
There's 7 minutes left.
until like the end of the day. So I'm gonna to go through.
Can everyone hear me? Really? You guys are going. It's right. All right. So, go to the next slide. Okay, so this is a beautiful, wonderful QR code that this is actually for. So don't use that. We have flyers in the other room that have a QR code for this toolkit. But what I'm going to be doing is just taking you through a little bit of my work, and what I've been doing is my purpose. I'll be doing it pretty quickly. Okay. So, and actually, click on that link there. Italy. But so my work has been building this toolkit, and this is our wonderful network. So, as Sarah mentioned, she did the first year of this program. Which are all about building that, initial outreach, growing this connection, and building the network. And then my year is the third year of this cycle. And so this is going to be all about building sustainability. And so as a part of that, we have been building out our how to build a network toolkit. This is based on our practices, based on all we make, that's what we know best. But it's also going to be something that we try to make it applicable and something that we try to make useful for someone who's not a Washington DC network, someone that might want to build a network in California, New York, or Montana, somewhere where there's a very different landscape of organizations. And so this document is going to contain our practices, but also kind of adaptable guidance on here's how the Washington League Network builds a cleaning network, and here's how you could build a cleaning network. And so I'm just going to kind of walk through it a little bit, but to go through the section, we always learn practices. So the three sections that we have are assessing the needs for a cleaning network, growing the connections for a cleaning network, and then sustaining the network, which is kind of the stage that we're in right now. But to get into assessing needs, so if you can actually scroll up to the link table of content. Perfect. Oh,
Table of content.
no, hold it. Okay, yes. So the information that we included is based on what we did. This was in 2022, the Washington Union Sarah conducted a network assessment to find out more about the landscape of the. So they asked, where do you clean? What do you clean? Are you volunteer-based? Do you have full-time staff? Those kinds of questions to really get a good sense of what we need in Washington. And so based on the work that Sarah did, this toolkit includes information on reaching out to readers and saying, hey, we'd love to get to know a little bit more about your organization. Information on gathering methods, surveys, and interviews, and those questions that you would want to ask to get to know your cleaning organization a little bit better. And then finally, we included information on finding insights, taking that data, whether it's a survey or an interview, or going on their website, and figuring out how to puzzle these together, where the gaps are, and what a cleaning network can do to fill them. And I'm going to scroll down to wherever it stops saying discussing needs and start saying connections. Perfect. So the next step, which is also what we did, was writing connections. And so all of this is me reporting on what Sarah did. But we included information on inviting leaders to join and giving them information on really tangible benefits that they can get out of a cleaning network. I think that part of the difficulty of starting any sort of initiative is getting people involved, much less excited about getting in, adding another meeting to their calendar or adding another meeting that they want to do. And so we really highlighted letting people know the practical benefits of being part of a cleaning network work, as well as highlighting exactly what involvement entails, whether that's going to a meeting, whether that's sharing your resources, attending a conference like we just had for the very first time this year. So highlighting that very specific information so that people know exactly what they're getting involved in. And then we included kind of practical information on doing online hubs and updates, having that website go and find resources. I know the open online we're mentioning that resource. And also just having newsletters and updates that people know what's new with the network. We're kind of like a mini AGO in a sense, and so letting people know where they can connect with us. And then finally we have staying in touch. So So this is kind of basic to our sustainability portion, but keeping people involved. Keeping people involved with the network and keeping that line of feedback so that people can say, hey, the landscape of cleaning has shifted and we have really new and difficult challenges that we're facing. And we see the need for addressing that. And then there's still in the final section, I will go through specific. But our final section is the same network. And so this toolkit, this is kind of my main work for this year. But this is meant to be a lead. And so we are in the third year of the program for the Washington Gleaning Network. And so we are still figuring out what works, and what's helpful and what's not. And so this toolkit is going to be something that might continue to be updated as we find out that information. But what we currently included is information on how to continue activities, how to stay connected, how to have that calendar and people know exactly where they can find us, where they can go to that. And then finally, you have information on evolving our purpose, as I'm sure you guys know. Some of this changes a lot over the years. And so we want to be cognizant of that and continue to have that assessment and connection where we ask people not just what they want at the start of the network, but what they want and it continues to grow and change. All right, I think I'm out of time. Do I have time for any questions?
No, but questions, follow up with them after.